Hey everybody, welcome back. And as promised, here we are, basically right where we left off last time, at the intersection of Lookout Mountain Avenue and Laurel Canyon Boulevard. Everything that we're going to talk about today takes place literally, like right here in this spot at this intersection, across the street at the Houdini estate, and then also just about 150 feet up the road from right here at another spot that I'm going to introduce you to in just a bit. Now, as I said last time, I felt like I needed some more time to give Frank Zappa his due, and I didn't want to be rushed through his story and some of his many outstanding musical accomplishments. So, we're going to get more into all of that, but we're also going to take a look at the rich history of not only the famous house that once stood right here on this piece of land, but also who built it, who lived in it before Frank Zappa, what happened to it, and why. We'll also explore some of the mystery of how it is possibly linked up with the other famous house that used to be directly across the road from it. Who may or may not have lived in that house, and we're going to clear up some misconceptions as to why there is another house nearby that has somehow incorrectly come to be associated with Harry Houdini when it should not be. So why did that happen? Well, let's talk about it. But first, let's start right here with the Tom Mix cabin, or what's left of it. In 1913, Charles Spencer Mann, the real estate tycoon, who is basically credited as being the original developer of Laurel Canyon, built the Laurel Tavern here at this spot at the base of Lookout Mountain. Charles Mann also built the Lookout Mountain Inn, and he was responsible for the trackless trolleys that took people in and out of this area. Because travel up here in a car in 1913 was actually very difficult. At that time, the area here was actually being referred to as bungalow land. The original log cabin building that once stood here on this lot was massive, with a main dining hall that was reported to have been 80 feet long and over 25 feet wide. There was a bowling alley in the basement and several very large and ornate fireplaces built out of stone. Now, on the hillside behind the cabin were built many stone staircases and pathways, and many interesting caves that were built out of stucco with electric lights wired up on the inside. The biggest male star of Hollywood's silent film era was cowboy western actor Tom Mix. Now, where his part of this story fits in here, and why the log cabin came to actually bear his name as the Tom Mix cabin, is a point of contention that causes a lot of debate. The details of this, which are now literally over 100+ years old, are a little sketchy. The big question is, did he own this log cabin or any other part of this property? The simple answer to that question is no. He did not technically own anything here, and his legal name does not appear anywhere on any Los Angeles County deed or any paperwork associated with 2401 Laurel Canyon Boulevard. So, the big question here is, who legally owned it? And why did people in the 1920s start referring to this log cabin as the Tom Mix cabin? Well, the person who was the sole owner at this address was this lovely young woman right here. Her name was Bessie Love, and she was a very successful silent film star of that era. She bought this place in 1920 when she was only 21 years old. At this point in her life, she had already appeared in about 70 silent films, and apparently she had a lot of money. So again, where does film star Tom Mix factor into this equation? Well, in the summer of 1915, when Bessie Love, who at that time was known by her real name, which was Juanita Horton, was brought by her mother to Hollywood to attempt to meet up with the famous actor Tom Mix, because they wanted to meet him and to talk about what young Juanita here would need to do to break into the film industry in Hollywood. She was only 16 years old at that time, and she was under the care of her very protective mother. Now, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time talking specifically about Bessie Love, because it's a sidetrack to this topic and her life story is not answering our question. So, to cut to the chase, she was young, she was talented, and she was very pretty. So, she was very quickly signed to a contract. They changed her name, and then she eventually went on to have a long and a very illustrious career in the film industry. Bessie Love and Tom Mix became very good friends, even though they never once appeared in any single film together as actors. Tom Mix was notoriously known to lie to people all the time about where he was born and where he grew up. Because of his image, he liked to tell people that he was born on a ranch somewhere in South Texas near the Rio Grande River. Well, he was not. He was actually born in a small town in Pennsylvania. But being born in Pennsylvania doesn't really seem to have the same ring to it for an action film star who was known for appearing in gritty westerns. Bessie Love, on the other hand, was born in Texas. And Tom Mix loved the idea that he had not only discovered her and had helped to get her career started in Hollywood, but he also liked to refer to her as a fellow Texan and a friend, even though that just simply wasn't true. In his mind, it sounded really good. So, they were good friends, even though their film careers were very different from one another. So again, what's the deal with Tom Mix being associated with this log cabin that everyone began to assume belonged to him? He was there all the time for many years. He hosted big parties, and he had a lot of very wealthy and very powerful, well-connected Hollywood film industry type people who were always there visiting him. Bessie Love did not prefer to live in the main building or in the larger part of the log cabin. She preferred to stay in the smaller guest house, which again, we have been constantly referring to here as the birdhouse. And that building, of course, is the one that's tucked away over here in the southwest corner of this property. Now, obviously, it's still there, but we can also assume that it probably looks a whole lot different now than it did back in the early 1920s. Tom Mix, while he was not the owner, he was basically granted the privileges of using the larger building as he saw fit. And so he came and went as he pleased. This was not his main residence, and he did not live here. He owned another modern, more expensive house over in Beverly Hills. But he treated this property here in Laurel Canyon basically as if it were like his own. So people just assumed that he owned it. Now, I also know what you're thinking, because it's very easy to come to the conclusion that something else may have been going on here between these two. Naturally, there have been rumors, and I am not going to speculate because there is no documentation or any hard evidence that there was any kind of hanky-panky going on between Tom Mix and the much younger Bessie Love. How much younger, you ask? About 18 years. And Tom Mix was married at that time to actress Victoria Ford. That kind of thing, I am not going to say didn't go on back then, but that would have been considered very, very scandalous back in that day and age. And that's the kind of thing that would have completely ruined and ended careers in the 1920s. Now, never mind the fact that Tom Mix was married a total of 5 times in his life, and he was considered to be a freewheeling big spender type who enjoyed his very lavish lifestyle. And never mind the fact that Victoria Ford actually tried to kill him in 1924 by shooting him in the spine with a handgun. There is still absolutely no evidence at all that Tom Mix was secretly maintaining any type of an illicit or an improper relationship with the much younger actress, Bessie Love. He is, however, always going to be associated with this property. And the log cabin, even though it's not there anymore, is probably always going to be referred to with his name as the Tom Mix cabin, even though there is solid proof that he just simply did not own this place. That's all I have to say about that part. So let's just move on.
Tom Mix was a really big deal back then, and he would be today's equivalent of a typical Hollywood action movie star, such as John Wayne of the 1950s, Clint Eastwood of the 1970s, or, I don't know, maybe like Bruce Willis of the 1980s, I guess. At that time in his career, Tom Mix was pulling in an annual salary of about $390,000, which in today's money would be more like the equivalent of about $7.2 million per year. So yeah, he was making really good money. Tom became good friends with the owner of the giant mansion across the street, Ralph Walker, and Mr. Walker's famous house guest, Harry Houdini. Now please note that I just referred to Houdini as a house guest and not house owner. That's because Harry Houdini didn't actually own anything out here in Laurel Canyon. And I'll get to all of that in just a minute. At this point, what I really want to do is briefly address some of the urban legends regarding the mysterious tunnels that may or may not have been constructed in this area between the Walker Mansion, his guest house on the other side of Laurel Canyon Boulevard, and maybe even the Tom Mix cabin. So yes, there is a lot of credible evidence that there was, at one time, at least one single tunnel, possibly more, running underneath Laurel Canyon Boulevard that led directly from the Walker Mansion over to his guest house on the other side. It has been described by Houdini's wife, Bess, as being quite elaborate, equipped with an elevator, electricity, and a ventilation system. In other words, it wasn't just a dirty old mine shaft, and someone with a lot of money had it built as a very expensive novelty. Now, it makes sense that someone like Ralph Walker would have done this. He was super wealthy, eccentric, and possibly even maybe a little bit weird and slightly gothic. Which also explains, possibly, as to why he and Harry Houdini seemed to hit it off so well. But the bottom line here is that while someone like Houdini would have been very intrigued by something like a secret tunnel system running underground, he definitely didn't have anything to do with its construction. Houdini was a lot of different things. He was a magician, a daredevil escape artist, an illusionist, a scholar, an actor. He even became a pilot later on in his life. But he was not an engineer, he was not a miner, or a spelunker. Now, when he arrived here in California to make an attempt at feature films, it was 1919, and the Walker Mansion had already been built here 4 years prior to that. He was also really not here for a very long time. He was here just long enough to make 2 movies in the span of a single year before giving up on the whole idea of becoming a movie star in Hollywood, and he returned to New York City in 1920. In the early evening of October 22nd, 1926, Harry Houdini was relaxing in the dressing room before his scheduled performance at the Princess Theatre in Montreal, Quebec. He had recently injured his ankle just a few days prior, so he was resting on a couch. Earlier that day, he had been at nearby McGill University, and he had loaned a book to a college student there, and at some point that evening, the student came to the theater to return the book, and he had brought 2 additional friends with him. They entered Houdini's dressing room and began to have an odd conversation with him about random topics related to Houdini's religious beliefs and whether or not he believed that he was protected by God from harm. Houdini remarked that he believed that yes, he was blessed with great strength and had always been able to withstand great pain, and that he was always able to recover quickly from physical injuries. So it was at that moment, while Houdini was speaking those words, that one of these men, whose name was Jocelyn Gordon Whitehead, unexpectedly approached him on the couch and began punching him very forcefully in the abdomen. Houdini was not expecting to be viciously attacked at that moment, and he was lying on a couch, which means he was completely unable to defend himself in any way. Now, the guy who attacked Houdini that evening was never charged with a crime, and no one really seems to know exactly why he did what he did or what his motives were. Maybe he was just trying to show off to his other friends in the room, or, maybe he was just a total dick. Hard to say, really. But either way, after this happened, Houdini told him to leave, and then, while he was still in immense pain, he got ready to go on with his performance. As it turns out, Whitehead had really seriously injured Houdini during that unprovoked beating, and had punched him so hard in the stomach that he had actually damaged some of the man's vital organs, including his appendix. Houdini spent the next 48 hours traveling by train to his next performance in Detroit in terrible pain, and he was unable to sleep at all from that point forward. He collapsed on stage at the Garrick Theater in Detroit and was later rushed into emergency surgery to have his ruptured appendix removed. Well, the operation seemed like it was successful, but you have to remember that this was in 1926, and antibiotics were still just a theory. And because his appendix had already burst by the time he had it surgically removed, he had basically suffered from severe blood poisoning, and he never recovered from a systemic bacterial infection in his abdomen. Houdini died on October 31st, 1926, at the hospital in Detroit, and reportedly, his final words were, quote, "I'm tired of fighting. I just do not want to fight anymore," unquote. He was 52 years old.
Okay, now just to wrap some of this up here, let me just say a couple more things about these tunnels that definitely seem to have been under this road somewhere, at least up until the 1950s, when they were either filled in or possibly turned into some kind of a storm drainage system. The only thing that still seems to be in question is whether or not the Tom Mix cabin was part of this tunnel system, and whether or not it was ever linked up with any of these other houses. Remember, Zappa's didn't move in here until 1968. Now, I read an interview with Gail Zappa that seemed to be from maybe about 20 years ago, and she was asked if she knew anything about this topic of the tunnels. She didn't really seem to directly answer the question, but kind of more evaded it for some reason. I'm not really sure why. But either way, the issue still remains inconclusive, at least as far as I know. Now, you've already heard me make reference several times to this guest house that I keep talking about, and more specifically, the house that we now know was actually the rented house that Houdini and his wife Bess lived in for about a year. Well, it turns out that after Harry died in 1926, his widow actually came back, and then she continued to live in this house up until about 1936. And it's a little more interesting than just that simple fact. She came back out here to Laurel Canyon because she became obsessed with the idea of trying to communicate with her late husband through the act of seance, or attempting to basically contact his spirit in order to communicate with him. And so dedicated was she to this idea of contacting her deceased husband that she literally kept a candle continuously burning next to a portrait of Harry for 10 straight years, up until 1936, when she held her final seance for Harry on the roof of the Knickerbocker Hotel in Hollywood. Apparently, she had done this exact same thing every single Halloween for 10 straight years. And immediately after the 10th one, which she considered to be a failure, in 1936, she put out the candle and said, quote, "10 years is long enough to wait for any man," unquote. And then she just stopped doing it, although others have continued to carry on this tradition. As a matter of fact, that tradition started happening right here at this spot and over at the Walker Mansion, even after it had burned down in 1959. But let's back up for just a minute and let's focus on the whereabouts
and the location of this guest house. Now I want you to take a look at this historic postcard from the early 1920s. There's more in this simple little picture than you might realize. Let's take a closer look and talk about everything that's actually included here. So, just as a point of reference, this is the exact same spot in modern times that you're seeing in this 1920s postcard. Yes, that is the intersection of Lookout Mountain Avenue and Laurel Canyon Boulevard, looking north, and exactly where we started this video today. Again, you're seeing the Tom Mix Zappa property over there on the left, behind the brown fence, and there's the Houdini estate on the right behind that giant wall of shrubbery. I also want you to take notice of just how much wider Laurel Canyon Boulevard is now compared to what it was back in the 1920s before it was even paved. This road has not only been widened a couple of times, it was also straightened out, because at one time, right as you went past the Tom Mix cabin, it made a very sharp hairpin turn to the left right there. And because by the late 1950s, people had begun using this canyon as a shortcut and a way to get from Hollywood up into Studio City quickly, this hairpin turn was beginning to not only slow traffic down, it was also becoming dangerous. Now, if you've watched any of my earlier videos, especially the first 2 episodes, you will surely know that Laurel Canyon Boulevard is a very busy road. Traffic is heavy and it's loud. And if you drive too slowly through here, by the way, people will tailgate the living crap out of you. Okay, so back to the postcard. Here is the corner of Lookout Mountain Avenue, which now has a stoplight and a crosswalk. Here's the Tom Mix cabin. And again, right across the street is the arched wall that you're seeing right there of what was then the Walker estate. And here is what I really want to point out to you on the bluff area that is just north of the Tom Mix cabin. I know it's hard to tell exactly what it is from this old photograph, but what you're seeing there is the old Walker guest house where Houdini and his wife Beatrice rented and lived in. And here's the same spot today. But other than the house being gone, obviously, since it burned up in the same fire as the Walker Mansion did in 1959, that hillside and that bluff has also been cut back for the straightening out of the road back in 1960. And one more thing. If you look really closely at this photo, you can literally still see the old roadbed as it curved off to the left right there sharply and then made its way up the hill. Can you see it? The trees that are there right now next to the road were not there at that level in 1960. That ground level was part of the bluff, and the house sat up on top of that bluff about 30 or 40 feet up off of what's now the road where you see the car. This vacant lot, by the way, which is owned by somebody, still has the same address as it did back in 1919, which is 2435 Laurel Canyon Boulevard. Now, as I just said, this house that was here also burned down in 1959, but unlike the bigger mansion, its ruins only stood here for less than a year after that. But the question is there anything at all left to be seen of this old house? Yeah, not much. This is pretty much about it right here.
Entering heat creates an added peril.
Hey, before we get back to Frank Zappa, since we're still here in the neighborhood, let's see if we can clear up a little misconception, or maybe just a case of mistaken identity, when it comes to the ownership of a couple of these really large historic mansions here on this part of Laurel Canyon Boulevard. Now, if you were to just walk up the road here, like less than 100 feet from this bluff, you would come across this property located here at address number 2451. Now, you're not going to be able to see anything back there, though, from out here on the road. It's just too secluded, and the walls are too high. But here's what it looks like on the other side of the wall. All right, now I don't want to spend a whole lot of time here, honestly, because this little issue can be cleared up very quickly. So here goes. For some reason, there is a ton of misinformation out there about this property that's currently owned by Rick Rubin and located at 2451 Laurel Canyon Boulevard, in that it is often referred to as either the, quote, Houdini Mansion, unquote, or else people are getting it mixed up with the Carriage House, which of course is the newer house that has been built on the Houdini estate in more recent times after the 1959 fire, and it is being mistaken as Rick Rubin's studio. There are even several YouTube videos up now, and some of them have tens, even hundreds of thousands of views, which do exactly this, and that is to mix these houses up and give out false information about who owns them or who lived in them. Even Wikipedia is a little sketchy on some of these facts. So let's clear this up and move on. Rick Rubin does not own anything on the current Houdini estate. He owns the house here at 2451 Laurel Canyon Boulevard. Likewise, Harry Houdini never, during his lifetime, ever even so much as set foot in this house that Rick Rubin now owns, even though he lived for a short time in the house next door to this property. How do I know that? It's easy. According to the Los Angeles County tax records, this 8,000 plus square foot mansion that has 10 bedrooms and 8 bathrooms inside and currently valued at about $6.5 million wasn't even built until 1925, which, as we now know, was 5 full years after Houdini left Laurel Canyon to return to New York City, never to return to the state of California ever again. At least not in his mortal form. That's it. So now, let's talk about Frank Zappa. Frank Vincent Zappa was born on December 21st, 1940, in Baltimore, Maryland. His parents were of Sicilian and Greek descent. But because of constant and severe health problems that Frank suffered as a child, possibly due to being exposed to mustard gas, which was being stored in a nearby warehouse where his father worked as a chemist, the family moved all the way from Baltimore to the West Coast and finally settled in the San Diego area when Frank was 12 years old. And it was here, at Mission Bay High School in San Diego, where the young Frank began his keen interests in music, mostly with drums and percussion to start off with, and then later as a guitarist at about the age of 17. Now, his family moved a total of 8 different times in less than a 6-year period, and they finally settled in Lancaster, California, where Frank graduated high school in 1958. But it was also during this same time frame that he started to grow restless and bored with school, and he began to resort to juvenile antics and general troublemaking, as a way to gain attention from brand new classmates that he seemed to have every few months. As an adult, his music and his overall philosophy of life could be characterized by the idea of just utter nonconformity to the expected standards of modern society at that time. He had an extreme commitment to individualism. He possessed a dark and satirical sense of humor, and he was dedicated to the idea of musical experimentation. He was, by almost all accounts, a completely self-taught musician who had begun writing his own pieces of classical music while he was still in high school, and he very quickly became considered a musical virtuoso on the electric guitar. Now, other than being a prolific and a genius musician, Frank Zappa was a strident advocate for freedom of speech and for political participation.
Of all the modern musical composers of the late 20th century, there is probably no one who could be considered more enigmatic and as utterly undefinable as Frank Zappa. His ability to fuse rock, jazz, and elements of avant-garde classical music into sound collages of noise and beauty is literally something to behold with awe. He was just simply astounding. So one of the most admirable qualities that Frank Zappa possessed was that no matter who he associated with or what kind of crowd he was around, he never used illegal drugs of any kind. Never. I don't even think the man drank alcohol. And even though he advocated for the decriminalization of drugs, he did not approve of drug abuse, and he did not suffer drunken fools lightly at his place. Now, he even once notoriously kicked Mick Jagger and his girlfriend, Marianne Faithfull, out of the house because they were both obnoxiously drunk and they were pissing him off. Zappa was a family man, and he and his wife, Gail, took the roles of being parents very seriously. Now, this house and property hosted a lot of very big parties, big, wild parties, and many of them were reported to have gotten quite a bit out of hand. At some point, it seems like the Zappas just more or less lost control of this whole situation, and it became chaos and mayhem over here, basically 24/7. Now, with the abundance of absolutely crazy stories of everything that allegedly went on in this place, you would think that Zappa had lived here for years rather than for just a few months. As soon as Zappa moved into the house that once stood here in this place, it almost instantly became the place that everyone in Hollywood and Laurel Canyon wanted to be. And he was very accommodating to an extent. Hey, since we were kind of on the side topic of Mick Jagger just about a minute ago, there's something here that I really want you to see. There's Mick, and there's his girlfriend at the time, singer Marianne Faithfull. She would have only been about 21 years old at that time. Then the other guy in this photo would be Captain Beefheart. Who's that, you might ask? Well, that's this guy. And yes, Frank Zappa produced that utterly insane record. By the way, that's not even a trout. It's a carp. And just so you know, Captain Beefheart has got to be one of the strangest humans who has ever lived. He once said in an interview that at one point in his life, he went for 18 months without sleeping. When asked how he was able to do this, his answer was that he only ate fruit. Okay. Anyway, back to Mick Jagger. Take a look at something here.
Do you see that design that's made out of tiles behind where Mick is sitting, right there by the fireplace? Well, now look at what is down there, left in the ruins of the old basement. Did you see that? So is that cool or what?
When Frank Zappa made his professional debut on his very first album with the Mothers of Invention in the summer of 1966, the album Freak Out was not an instant commercial or even a critical success. In fact, it was initially trashed by most of the mainstream music critics at that time, with one of them actually even calling the album, quote, musical gibberish and a tragic waste of vinyl, unquote. But like anything that was way ahead of its time, the album gradually began to gain a cult following, and then it began to sell better in Europe than it did here in the United States. So now, 60 years or so later, it's considered to be groundbreaking and even culturally significant. Hugely successful artists, all the way from the Beatles to Primus and even System of a Down, have all stated that they have been heavily influenced not only by Zappa, but by this album specifically. Paul McCartney has even stated several times in interviews that when he and the rest of the Beatles first heard this record, they attempted to answer it by writing and recording the Sgt. Pepper's album. So it's pretty safe to say that within just about a couple of years or so, Frank Zappa had established himself as a radical new voice within the counterculture of avant-garde rock music. Now, if you're only just maybe somewhat familiar with him and some of his records, I mean, he only recorded somewhere around 62 of them just within his short lifetime, with another 70 or so that have come out since his untimely death at the young age of only 52. You may probably be of the opinion that most of his music could be considered difficult to listen to at best. He is an acquired taste, to say the least. There are people who absolutely love him, and there are others that may only have just heard a couple of his songs and they decide very quickly that his quirky and his satirical music is just simply not for them. Okay, fair enough. I myself kind of sit somewhere in between these two groups. I admire his audacity and his brilliant creativity, but no, his music is not for the casual listener. It can be noisy and gritty, and sometimes even downright sadistic and ugly, on purpose. And he designed it that way. Here's the thing that you have to remember about him. He's trying to get a reaction out of an audience, and he does not care at all if you find the music pleasing or not to your ears. He's trying to challenge you to keep listening, rather than him just creating sounds that play in the background, like at your office at work or in an elevator. And he's also kind of messing with your head at the same time. He has famously stated on many occasions that music can be, quote, anything, anytime, any place, and for no reason at all, unquote.
He wrote dense and angular compositions that were written specifically for other musicians to find very difficult to play. Odd meters, bizarre key changes that happen very suddenly without warning, and he mostly disregarded all traditional musical boundaries. So in other words, no rules and basically anything goes. And just to show you how his music and also his general persona caused extreme reactions in people, he was once viciously attacked on stage at a concert in London by an angry and deranged person from the audience. This guy jumped onto the stage and then pushed Zappa into the orchestra pit. This was in 1971, and his injuries were quite serious, with trauma to his head, his back, and his neck, and he even suffered a broken leg. He was in a wheelchair for almost 18 months after that incident. And of course, true to form, he never stopped working a single day during that time period in the wheelchair. That's just how he rolled.
So when Zappa moved in here to the old Tom Mix cabin, he wanted the biggest house that he could find because his goal was to have enough room for a large music studio and a place that was big enough to hold his band rehearsals in. So this house provided that, but because of the constant partying that was going on over here, seemingly every day of the week, he was having a hard time getting any of his work done. And remember, Frank Zappa was reported to have been the type to work on music 12 to 14 hours a day, 7 days a week, like literally for his entire life, right up to the very end. So they left. One of the very best known quotes from him during this time was this. He said, "I had to leave because it seems like every nut job in the state of California has figured out where I live and they won't stay away." Now, I think that there may have been more to that statement than what it seems maybe just right on the surface. He might just sound a bit annoyed by all of it, but there may have been something else that was going on here. And I'm going to go into a little bit more depth on that comment later in another episode. So just remember that quote, and we'll come back to it. Frank Zappa was an extremely intelligent and an astute man. And I think that he saw certain things happening around him here, and he could tell that maybe something wasn't completely right. But let's just move on for now.
Just in case you've been wondering this entire time, what exactly happened and what became of the old Tom Mix cabin that used to sit here on this property? Well, here's the story. As we've already concluded, Frank Zappa's time here in this house was eventful, but very brief. He bought a big and expensive house less than a mile away from here, over on Woodrow Wilson Drive, and then he lived there until his death in 1993. After he left this house, life went on with other renters, mostly in a normal fashion, for about 10 years or so. But by the late 70s, the property had begun to fall into disrepair due to neglect and vandalism. And then it sat vacant for a couple of years. And that is when squatters began using the grounds and the old house as a place to hide out, do drugs, and basically just use it as a shelter until they got run off by the cops. On Halloween night in 1981, the Tom Mix cabin caught on fire and was completely destroyed. People who lived nearby were convinced that someone had been using the basement as a PCP or a meth lab, and eventually somebody just blew it up. The fire itself was actually described as a series of explosions and not just a typical or an accidental structural blaze. There were definitely explosive chemicals involved in this fire. And you know what? It's really all just very sad and unfortunate, because this old house seems like it was really awesome and just so rich in history. I really wish that it was still here, and I think that I would have loved to have seen it in its heyday.
Well, that was a lot of fun. Please come back and join us again next time on Wolf River Music Television for our final episode of the Laurel Canyon miniseries. The last one is going to be very different in topic than all of the previous ones that we've done so far. The last one is about the rise and the fall of the good times and the changes that were inevitable to happen. Some of it might shock you, but don't miss it. And please subscribe to our channel. This is Billy. Good night. Thank you. And we'll see you right here next time. Frank Zappa, but Zappa didn't move into the house that's behind me until about February or March of 1968. And that was after he had... That's actually a good sign. That truck's moving, right? Okay, good. In fact, why don't we just come down just a little bit right here. Okay.